What are 5 signs of somebody who has poor boundaries?
I mean, the first one is probably going to be, I'm going to just take up probably the first three for my recovering people pleasers, my recovering perfectionists, my over functioning, codependent folks, people who are willing to betray themselves in order to make other people happy. And I think that those people will relate because I'm a recovering perfectionist myself, to the fact that when they were growing up or in particular relationships, that was the only way that you could feel safe. That was the only way that you could know that you were going to be seen and validated and loved. And with healthy boundaries, you know that you can set those boundaries in your relationships and also still be met. So I'm going to take up the first three slots with those folks and just say, if you are struggling with that, if you're struggling with saying no when you know you don't want to do it, if you're struggling with feeling like you have to be perfect in every relationship in every way, if you're struggling with the fact that you feel like you have to overdo, then you're definitely probably struggling with boundaries. The last two that I think are ones that probably aren't as common is the way that we treat ourselves and the way we show with ourselves. A lot of times we think about boundaries just as external ways that we interact, but if you aren't willing to do for yourself what you said you were going to do, you said you were going to get up and do this particular thing, you were going to go for a walk, you were going to journal, and you find yourself not having time to do it for yourself, it's most likely because you have no energy, no time for yourself because you're giving it away to everyone else. So asking yourself, how am I able to do for myself what I said I was going to do? And if I'm not, probably need to look at my boundaries. Last thing, the number five, a reason that you may be struggling with boundaries is if you're not able to have the tough conversations that we have to have in relationships in order to let people know what we need and how we feel. And that kind of ties back into the first three, but a lot of us don't want to disappoint folks. We don't want people to feel like we don't care about them. And hard conversations aren't fun to have. Even when you have good boundaries, nobody wants to have a hard conversation about how something isn't meeting their needs. And so if you find yourself skipping the tough conversations and just kind of AKA going with the flow, which is really ignoring your emotions for the comfort of others, then you're probably struggling with boundaries.
So many people are struggling with perfectionism right now. And it seems like it's at the root of a lot of people's problems when it comes to setting boundaries. So I'd love to unpack this a bit and see like what your thoughts are on how somebody can recognize if they're a perfectionist, not just somebody who maybe has high standards for themselves. And then also like what can they do to be, I guess, less perfect in their own mind.
Yeah, I think for recover, I call them recovering perfectionists because I'm one. I think it's such a tough thing to learn that, first of all, there is no such thing as perfect. That doesn't even seem like a concept that's real when you're a perfectionist. For myself, I had to start allowing myself to do things that normally in society are kind of not okay to do. For example, being late. I just started allowing myself to show up a couple minutes late and seeing if I would survive it. Because when you're a perfectionist, you feel like you won't survive making a mistake. I allowed myself to kind of not beat myself up when I missed something on my calendar or when I had to reschedule. I think that you kind of start, you kind of have to start purposely putting yourself in positions where things may not go right. And I think that also ties into allowing other people to show up for you. I was the kind of person, I have to do it. I'm going to do it right. I'm going to do it better. When you allow other people to show up for you and help you, that you have to allow them to do it how they want to do it. And knowing that somebody else can do it the way that they choose to do it and that it'll be okay and you'll get the support and you'll get it done is also really helpful to releasing the false sense of control that you feel like you have by being a perfectionist.
Do you think with perfectionism, it stems from people's parents being like super tough on them growing up? Or do you think with the rise of technology and social media and seeing all the highlight reels, do you think people are just now more susceptible to developing a perfectionist mindset based on what they see online?
Yeah, I think that it's important to mention that there are tons of people out there who aren't perfectionists. Perfectionists don't believe that. We think that everyone we see is doing it better, doing it greater, and just better at it. There are tons of people who aren't. For myself, I didn't have really tough standards growing up, and I didn't have to do things perfectly, and I still somehow turned out to be a perfectionist. So I do think that it a lot of it, and just to share a little bit for myself, for me, perfectionism started from I want to be better, I want to succeed. That has to mean being perfect. I just kind of rationalized in my own mind that in order to be able to have some sense of success, it would mean showing up perfectly. And probably being a veteran in the military also helped with that in a career where you have to be perfect all the time. So it was the perfect environment. So I think people should get curious about when they feel like their perfectionism tendencies began. I do think, to your point, that social media today, and before social media, if you're a woman, it was magazines, it was MTV. Those things were making us feel that being perfect was the only way to be successful, to be considered societally acceptable. And I think that social media has just taken the place of those things.
And so, what's the difference between perfectionism and discipline?
Yeah, that's such an important question. So, discipline is doing what you say that you are going to do, showing up. I think it's also about consistency. There's a big difference between being consistent and feeling like you have to be perfect. So, if I have to show up every day at 10 a.m. to do a meeting, I'm being consistent, I'm showing up, I'm being disciplined, I'm doing what I have to do. If I feel like my house has to be in perfect order, everything has to be folded, and I have to have on a particular outfit and a particular type of makeup and all of these type of things in order to get to that meeting, might be leaning a little bit towards perfectionism rather than discipline. I think we have to really ask ourselves also the question, how are we talking to ourselves? So discipline doesn't require you to beat yourself up when you make a mistake. Discipline doesn't require you to tear yourself apart just because you missed a meeting or you were 5 minutes late. So how are you talking to yourself is also going to be helpful in understanding which one you're doing in your life.
Yeah, there's so much nuance to this part of the conversation, and I'm glad that we're unpacking this because, like you said, there is a big difference between discipline and perfectionism. But I wouldn't consider myself to be a perfectionist. I am hard on myself, and if I say I'm going to do something, I do everything I possibly can to make sure I do that thing. Because if I don't, it's I somehow, for a second, feel like a sense of shame of like, oh my gosh, you didn't follow through with what you said you were going to do, whatever. But I don't ever have the mindset of like, you're not good enough, you're not good enough, you're not good enough. You need to always be better. The other part of this that I think it's important for us to discuss is that with the growing popularity of self improvement, self help space, personal development space, we become at times addicted to just getting a little bit better each day, which I think there's merit to that. And I think we always should be looking to improve ourselves and have a growth mindset. However, it's a slippery slope, especially for people who are drawn to perfectionist tendencies to say, I always have to be working on something about myself because I'm not good enough. How can somebody separate the two things?
I think it also depends on what type of self improvement work you're doing. So, for example, in my work, my goal for you is to live your life, to get out of, you're not healing to be healing forever. You're healing so that you can actually get into your life and live and joy and peace and excitement and all of those things. So, when we get clear on why we're doing this work, because you're absolutely correct, and I always talk to this about this in workshops and with clients. Why are you taking this next course? Why are you taking this next workshop? Why did you buy this next book? I think it's always great to be introspective and to learn and to grow. But healing for healing's sake, which is what I call it, is something that I think we get caught up in, and we just trade in whatever we were being perfectionist about before for healing or for wellness. I don't think that healing and wellness is actually growing recently. I think it's been growing probably since the 90s, and becoming a part of our everyday conversation. I do think that, like we've been talking about social media and all of having the language to be able to express ourselves and to understand more about why we feel the way we feel has been making a lot of us more interested in continuing this work because it is changing our lives. And I think it's, if we're going to be doing something a lot, healing isn't a terrible thing to do, but I think it's also important that we not just heal for healing's sake, for lack of a better term. I also just want to talk to the point you made about when you say you're going to do something, you're going to do it. And I think for anyone who's listening who feels like that, it's good to be a person who shows up and does what you say you're going to do. It's good to be a person who's consistent, who's disciplined, who's willing to take a chance and a risk on themselves. It also doesn't mean that you have to tear yourself up along the way. And I think that the healing work that we do helps us to be on our own side while we're showing up for ourselves. And that's why I do it. And that's why I teach it as well.
Right. And getting into the next thing you said, which I think I would say that everybody to some extent has struggled with this, and that's people pleasing. Like just saying something just for the sake of not upsetting somebody, saying something for the sake of just fitting in, like doing something because you don't want to rock the boat or whatever the example is. I think we live in the world of extremes, unfortunately, where it's like, okay, I'm no longer going to be a people pleaser. So I'm just going to be super independent and I'm going to care only about myself. And I'm not going to risk, violating my own boundaries for the sake of doing something that might help somebody else. Right. How do you think people can learn to have a better relationship with pleasing other people?
I mean, the first thing I'm going to recommend is therapy or coaching or a spiritual teacher. I can't I mean, it's so helpful to be able to say these things out loud to someone in a safe space and have them reflect to you exactly what's happening. So that's the first thing I'm going to recommend. But the second thing with people who may not be able to afford therapy or maybe aren't ready or don't feel like it's for them with people pleasing is asking yourself, why is their comfort more important than mine? Why is what they need more important than what I need? Why am I not also someone that I'm valuing in my decision making process? And beginning to get curious about that with the decisions that you make is incredibly powerful in itself. I don't think we often have a sense of awareness about our people pleasing or our perfectionism. We're just kind of going, and we think, a lot of us think, it's just a part of who I am. People pleasers often say things like, I've always been a caregiver. I've always been a giver. I've always been someone who showed up, supported the people around me. It makes me feel good. Being a carer and a giver is one thing. Giving to the point where you feel like it's the only way you can receive love and support and affection and relationships is not the same. The reciprocity is not there. It's not an equal exchange or relationship. So I think people should really get curious about that question. How am I valuing someone else more than I'm valuing myself? And allow it to begin to un- unveil, for lack of a better term, the ways in which they are not taking their own worth into consideration when they make decisions.
So you said so many people lack self-awareness when it comes to this stuff, and I totally agree with you. And there is also a difference between, like you alluded to, being kind, compassionate, giving, which these are all so important when it comes to relationships. But the main like red flag to be aware of within yourself, if you are somebody who's a quote unquote people pleaser, is are you giving somebody else's feelings more importance and more power than you give your own? Is that like the main thing people should be looking out for?
Absolutely. Because yes, we want to be empathetic. Yes, we want to be kind, but everyone else cannot always come first. There has to be times where we're also a priority. There has to be times where something in your relationships happened and you really wanted to say something about it, but the people pleasing part of you told you it's better to just ignore it. How many times have you ignored what was happening and just stuffed down those emotions and those feelings because you felt that that was what was best to keep the relationship in place? And so then you're not really keeping the peace. It may be peaceful between you two because you haven't had the tough conversation. But I would imagine that there's not a lot of peace happening within you because you're keeping all of those emotions inside yourself.
Yeah, and I think it's a big red flag, like early on in a relationship, if somebody on the opposite side is like super, super agreeable, because I just think you know that eventually the resentment's going to build and they're going to end up resenting themselves for not speaking up for themselves. And that's going to end up being projected onto you and things fall apart. Right. And then what happens is whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship, the other person on the other side of it is like, well, wait, what just happened? Like we had these conversations, you said you wanted this or you want to do that, and now what's going on here? So I think for people who are listening to this, and again, I'm no saint when it comes to relationships, but I just think based on what you've shared and what I've learned is that the less you speak up for yourself, like the less attractive you're going to be, and you can do it in a way that's healthy and not aggressive, right? But because I think people, at the end of the day, people want to be around people that are not afraid to be themselves, not afraid to express themselves in the most authentic way possible.
Yeah. And I think also you want someone who's attracted to you for you. And so when you show up as yourself with all of the things that you have to say and do, or all the things that matter to you, that's what's most important, not necessarily meeting whatever standard that you think is going to help you fit in with them or belong to them.
So I would imagine, like, if we unpack the onion, peel the onion back more between both perfectionism and people pleasing, and then we'll get into saying no in a second. But I think that's also tied into this. If you peel the onion back far, like, if you peel the onion back enough, I think at the root of it is going to be people who are insecure and are just not happy with themselves or not confident, and because of that, they are just looking for other things to kind of fill them up, whether it's people, whether it's things, whether it's validation to help them kind of like flourish in a way that's fabricated. What advice would you have for somebody who's feeling insecure, feeling not confident, low self-worth, so that they can begin to work on themselves so that, setting boundaries and things that we're talking about becomes more natural to them?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say is to take away any language that feels harmful or projected or judgy or sticky. So, for example, a lot of people don't like the word insecure. I know for myself that would be something that would kind of make me shy away. I wouldn't want to admit, that I was feeling insecure. I'd admit that I was feeling a particular way. So sometimes we have to use language that's kind of like, I don't feel like I'm valued. I don't feel like I'm cared for. I don't feel like I'm loved. I don't feel like I'm seen. I don't feel like I'm understood or heard. I don't feel like I belong. I think it's really important, though, to be compassionately honest with yourself, is basically what I'm saying. When we are harsh on ourselves or we judge ourselves or even just use language that we all use in society, insecure, we all know what that means. It can keep us from confronting the truth, which keeps us from getting the help that we need. So that's the first thing that I would do for somebody who may be like, you know what, I'm not feeling like myself, for lack of a better word. The other thing is know that this is going to take time. I hate, I think a lot of people, especially if you're a perfectionist listening, you want the checklist, you want to be able to do this and figure out the steps to get there. That's not how healing works, unfortunately. It's a process. Many of us have to learn how to love ourselves. Many of us have to learn how to not be hard on ourselves. Many of us have been hard on ourselves since before. We don't remember a time where we weren't. Maybe somebody else was hard on us. And so we have that language inside of us. So you're learning a new way of interacting with yourself. Be kind and give yourself grace with the fact that this is not something that is you've practiced before and that it's going to take time.
And then once somebody gets to that point where they've let go of the shame and maybe the quote unquote stigma of not feeling content with where you're at in your life or content with who you are, like what would you say are a few things that, generally speaking, can help elevate somebody's self-worth?
Yeah, again, this is going to sound repetitive, but the first thing is going to be boundaries. I guarantee you there are people in your life that are draining you, that are making you feel, I mean, not necessarily, to be clear, they're not making you feel bad. They're doing things that make you feel bad, but you are allowing them in your life. So you're a part of the problem too. So when you realize I'm saying yes to this person and they make me feel terrible, then you can call your power back and say, I'm going to end this relationship, or I'm going to put space between us, or I'm going to have the tough conversation. So boundaries is going to be the first thing that's going to help you feel better. The next thing that's going to be really important is leaning into your community. I think a lot of us feel like we have to do healing alone, and we don't. Your friends, your family, the people that you can rely on and that will support you, they're going to help remind you of who you are. They're going to help remind you of the amazing person that you are to them. And I don't think we realize how powerful that can be when we're going through something that's really hard like this. And the last thing that I would say that is accessible to almost all of us, journaling is incredibly powerful. It's easy to do. If you don't like writing pen and paper or you don't have time to do it, use the notes section of your phone and write out when you're on the train or when you're commuting. It's a super powerful thing that we don't realize how much we admit to ourselves when we say it, pen to page or writing it out.
And I would say one of the words that goes in line with boundaries is saying no. And you talked about, like, the inverse of that is a sign that somebody has poor boundaries is that they can't say no. How do we get better at saying no to things we don't want to do?
The hard part is realizing that disappointment is a part of life and we can't avoid it. Most of us aren't saying no because we don't want to disappoint people and we don't want to feel the feelings of discomfort that come with saying no. But we free other people to find somebody who wants to say yes to them. And I think if you really care about that person, then saying no is actually the best thing that you can do if you don't want to do whatever it is that they're asking you to do. We also free ourselves because instead of holding that resentment towards saying yes to something we don't want to do, we are now free to do something that we want to do. So when we switch the mind frame around no being negative and realize that it's actually a positive thing that we can do in our relationships and an honest thing that we can do, it becomes a lot easier.
Right. And like, let's just, in a real life scenario, um, let's just say that somebody is asking somebody to do something that they don't necessarily want to do. What would you say would be like a healthy dialogue or response for somebody to say no?
Yeah, the example I always use is your friend asking you to help them move. We've all been asked to help a friend move, and none of us ever wanted to do it. But for the most part, nobody is super thrilled to help somebody move, right? So you get asked by a friend to move, but you actually can't do it this time. You have something going on, or maybe you've been really stressed and you need this time off for yourself. And so the friend says, "Hey, can you help me move?" In the situation that we don't want to do, we say yes, and we say yes and we don't want to do it, and either A, we resentfully show up and resentfully help them move, and the friend can tell that we don't really want to be there, and now we have a new problem in our relationship because the friend can tell we're pissed with them, and we're going to have a tough conversation about the fact that we're not behaving like ourselves while we're helping them move. Or worse, the day before or coming up to the move, we cancel last minute. So that's kind of what can happen when you say yes to something that you don't want to do. The positive thing that we can do is the friend can say, "Hey, can you help me move?" And we can be honest and say, "I know that you need help, but I really can't help you move right now. This is what's going on in my life. Or I just can't do it this weekend. But when you move in, can I help you unpack? Or when you move in, can we go to dinner? Or is there something I can send you? Can I send you a meal because you just moved into your house?" Realizing there's other ways we can show up for our friend and that we can support them that don't require us to necessarily do what we are being asked that we can't do.
When it comes to ourselves, I think a lot of times we have like the worst boundaries with stuff within ourselves. Like we say we're going to eat healthy and then like 3 hours go by and we're stopping at fast food, or say we're going to, go for that walk and then we're not, and say we're going to work on that book or whatever the example is. In your own experience with just both being a perfectionism, with both being a perfectionist, somebody who's been really hard on yourself throughout the years, and then also somebody who has positioned herself as being somebody who's like one of the leaders in talking about boundaries. What are some of the things that you tell yourself when you're about to disrespect your own boundaries that you have for your own life?
The first thing that I tell myself is you're just being human. So let's calm down because if I don't do that, then I'm about to tear myself apart. Just being honest. Even though I, teach this and I understand this, I'm still tough on myself. So I say, you're human, calm down. The next thing that I would do is I would say, do you actually just need rest right now? Sometimes we think like, oh, I have to do this. I have to push through. Do you? Do you have to push through? Or can you give yourself some freedom and flexibility to change your mind? Because the wonderful thing about healing is that we do give ourselves the power of choice, to do what we need to do in our lives. Another thing that I think is really important when it comes to doing what you said you're going to do is setting the goal realistically in the first place. Sometimes we say, "I'm going to start being healthy," for example, and then we change our entire diet in one day and we're exercising 5 times a week and we've never even like ran before. And all of a sudden we're doing all of these things. Start with a walk. Start with just adding a salad. Start with something that feels tangible and that you actually have space for. I always like to find a way to trick myself into doing what I know I need to do for myself by finding ways to integrate it that are things that I already like to do. So I like to cook. I'm going to find ways to improve my food before I necessarily start a new weightlifting regimen. Like I'm more likely to stick to that than I am the weightlifting regimen. If you like to kayak, for example, sign up for a kayaking class. Don't sign up for Pilates if you know you're not going to go to the Pilates. Like you just have to try to find ways to do what it is that you love and also meet yourself. That's just with a health example. But I think all of us are trying to find ways to show up for ourselves more in the way that we care for ourselves, especially as us millennials are getting older and as Gen Xers are getting older. And I think that it can be a really helpful way to be kind to yourself too daily.
And speaking of being kind to ourselves, and along these same lines, like I think we've talked about one of the downsides of people pleasing is we end up losing ourselves and we end up almost formulating a different version of ourselves, a different identity based on what people want from us. So I think probably the thing that people must do to get better at staying true to themselves is identify like who they actually are as a person, like what they want. What have been some things that have helped you over the years, like really begin to identify like who Yasmine is, what you stand for, so that you can better understand whether or not something works within that frame of what you want your life to look like.
Yes, the number one thing is curiosity. I talk about this in my new book. It's a quote from Clarissa Pinkola Estes' book, Women Who Run with Wolves. She talks about how every time you have an experience show up in your life, it's a door, it's an opening for you to begin to be curious about something that may be present for you. And I think a lot of us just have life happening and we're not even really paying attention to what's happening or why it may be happening for us. If a terrible thing happens, we just say, oh my God, my life sucks, versus what can I learn here? And so I think being curious about what you can learn about yourself through the experiences that you're having and what's going on in your world, for me, that has been the number one way that I've been able to be present to what I really want, to what I really want to do. And more important than that, what I don't have space or time for, so that I can be clear about which direction I want to go in. That curiosity also allows me to change my mind, which I think we often are too hard on ourselves and don't allow ourselves to do that as well.
So and the fifth thing you shared, I think, is arguably the most important one, and that's not being able to have tough conversations. Why do you think we avoid having tough conversations, even though we know on the other side of that, in many ways, like our life will actually improve?
They're uncomfortable. I think, we'd much rather talk about something exciting than talk about something that sucks. There are people who love being confrontational, and that's also probably a thing that they have to explore. They're like overly like, let's have the conversation. But for most of us, I think it's because it's uncomfortable. I think when we learn the beauty of being uncomfortable, especially with people that we can trust, we realize that it's safe to be uncomfortable and have the conversation. And actually, there's growth in having a hard conversation and learning more about each other and ourselves.
Like, what are some tips you have for somebody that is maybe there's something on their mind? Let's say they're in a romantic relationship, because I think this is very common in that
Mm-hmm.
something on their mind, they want to bring it up to their partner. But again, at the risk of the relationship not being perfect, or at the risk of their partner being mad at them or potentially wanting to exit the relationship, they don't say anything, even though it's really bothering them. What do you think is an effective way to communicate something that's challenging so that it leads to growth for the relationship?
This may not be what people want to hear, but if you're in a romantic relationship and you're nervous to have a conversation that's tough because you think someone may exit the relationship, I think the conversation you need to have is with yourself, and whether this is a relationship you should be in where you can't have a tough conversation without feeling like the person may leave. Because honestly, if after having a tough conversation you want to leave, maybe this relationship needs to end. I mean, that's that's my perspective personally. But in a healthy romantic relationship, we can have hard and tough conversations. And one of the ways that we can do that is by saying, hey, I need to talk to you about what happened last week. Do you have space later on today? Or right now, if you're available? And then come, because even in romantic relationships, we still should honor other people's boundaries and ask them if they're available in that moment instead of just launching a bunch of stuff on them. And then we get in the relationship, in the conversation, excuse me, and we're able to talk about it in a calm way, in a respectful way, and in a way that we're both heard, both seen, both honored. I want to be clear. Just because you're heard, seen, and honored doesn't mean that your partner agrees with you, doesn't mean that they want to do what you want to do. Relationships require compromise. Relationships require understanding what each other has to say. And I think knowing that just because someone doesn't want to do what you want to do, it doesn't mean that they don't value you or they don't respect you. We're both individuals and we have to learn how to come together and to be on the same page. And I think sometimes we skew, they don't agree with me, they don't want to do what I want to do, with being in a loving and healthy relationship. Healthy relationships are going to have discourse, they're going to have disagreements. It's just how we go about disagreeing, how we go about communicating to each other.
Right. And then with that, though, I think each person's going to have their own deal breakers or boundaries, if you will, that the person, they don't want the other person kind of crossing. And it's up to that person to make a decision in that moment to say, okay, like if they're hearing me and they don't agree with me and they're not willing to change that behavior or whatever, well, then it's on you to say, okay, like, is this the right relationship for me? Because this is going to be a deal breaker. Because I think what happens, and this goes back to what we've been talking about, is for the sake of staying in a relationship and, not and pleasing the other person, we people end up staying in those situations, even though their boundary has been crossed and they've had the conversation. And then that same behavior might repeat itself down the road. And they're like, well, wait, my partner is not changing. It's like, well, because you're essentially telling them you're okay with that. Right. And so I think that's another layer to this, that that's the beauty of having boundaries and knowing yourself and knowing what you stand for, knowing what you want, is that when somebody crosses that, if they're not willing to change that behavior, you're not okay with it, then you have to have the confidence and the self-respect to walk away from something like that, because otherwise you're going to end up resenting yourself and your partner for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and then worse than that, you're in a relationship that isn't even aligned with what you want. And that's why I said in the beginning, if you are afraid to have a conversation with your partner because you feel like this is a boundary that they're not going to be on board with, that you have for yourself, and they're not going to want to do it, and so you're avoiding the conversation just to keep the relationship, you really need to not have, before you have a conversation with your partner, you need to have a conversation with yourself and say, is this even a relationship that is aligned with what I want in my life? Or am I staying in this relationship hoping that they will change, or that they will meet my needs, or that they will do whatever it is that I want, or I can people please my way out of this, or I can be perfect and they'll see that I should be, that I'm the person that they really want. None of those things are going to happen. And in the end, if they do happen, you've most likely abandoned yourself in the name of being in relationship with them. And at some point, that reckoning with yourself is going to come, and you're going to realize, I'm not even myself in this relationship. And I see this with people in relationships when they get in their 30s and 40s and 50s and realize, I married this person, or I'm in this relationship with this person for years. This isn't even ever what I really wanted, but I never gave myself the space to explore it with myself. So even as someone who's married, before I go to my husband and have a conversation, I'm usually talking to myself first to see, why am I bringing this conversation to him? What do I need? So that when I come, we can have a healthy conversation about what it is that I need, versus me bringing all of my issues to him for him to solve. He's going to bring his stuff. I'm going to bring my stuff. And together we'll figure out how to make a decision for the relationship. So I think that's also really, really important to say, because in relationships, we often think that the relationship is the place to have all discussions. It is, but you have a relationship with yourself too, and the conversation should start with you.
Totally agree. And I think one of the other things that can be hard to do, but I've heard from people that it's like necessary, as far as having a conversation that leads to growth and not to more like contempt and arguments and stuff, is using I statements and just taking responsibility for the way that you're feeling, and that owning that nobody can make you necessarily feel a certain way, that you have to own your feelings no matter how awkward it can sound. Have you found that to be effective as well with your work and even in your own marriage?
Yeah, I think in my marriage and my friendships, saying, hey, when that happened, I felt like this, or I'm feeling like this, or I would love for us to do this. Sometimes thinking more about what you need versus then thinking it's an opportunity to tell them about how they're not meeting your needs. When you don't meet my needs, and you don't do this and you don't do this, versus just saying, hey, I'd love to hang out with you more. Like, what do you actually want to have happen in saying that? I think it's a different way of connecting. And again, that comes from asking yourself, is this person violating my boundaries, or are they actually just really busy and I want to hang out with them more? If I want to hang out with my partner more, then I can just say, I'd love to connect with you more, versus saying, hey, you've been too busy at work lately. Is that really violating my boundaries, or do I just want to connect more and I want to talk about that? That's something that's also really important in boundaries. Having self responsibility. Not everybody has to meet your boundaries. Boundaries are not an ultimatum, they're an option. People have the option to either meet your boundaries or not. So remembering that, yes, it may be a deal breaker for you, but if they don't want to do it, then the relationship may not work. It doesn't mean that because this is a deal breaker for you, they have to meet it.
If you're like me and are constantly on the go juggling work, social outings, and all the other chaos life throws your way, I have found an absolute game changer that gives me some time back. Jimmy's Famous Meals is a local meal prep company that provides fully cooked, chef prepared meals and can deliver them right to your doorstep. I am currently about to eat the Greek lemon chicken, which is one of my favorites. I get this every week, and I absolutely love Jimmy's Famous Meals. They are so good and delicious. Picture this: no more stressing over what to cook after a long day, and always having a wholesome, delicious meal waiting for you in your fridge. Their meals are prepped, cooked, and ready to heat and eat in minutes. So say goodbye to the hassle of grocery shopping and meal planning. With Jimmy's Famous Meals, convenience is served straight to your doorstep. So if you're looking to get your time back and make healthy eating easy, head to jimmysfamousmeals.com. And when you use the promo code Doug25 at checkout, you'll get 25% off your order. Cheers to healthy eating. Yeah, and that's like, what do they say? I mean, it's like rejection is redirection. I mean, I know that kind of sounds very cliche, but I mean, you don't want to be with somebody that continually violates your boundaries, because then you will end up hating yourself. And it's the same, going back to the bigger theme of the conversation. If you are somebody that doesn't have your own identity for who you are as it relates to the world, your own values, your own beliefs, your own goals, if you're constantly pleasing others, constantly like working to become somebody that you're not, you can't say no, like your relationship to life is going to be really, really bad, because you haven't done the work, so to speak, to establish who you are and really stand up for yourself. I think also, when it comes to tough conversations, do you think that there's like a time? Like, I mean, I hate to like say it's a one size fits all approach for this, but I would imagine there's some level of generality to this. Where is there like a healthy time frame for having a tough conversation? Let's just say, for the sake of this conversation, you and your husband, your husband does something that really aggravates you, and it happens like right now. For you, what would your processing look like? And then is there a time frame where it's like, once it's past a certain time, like don't bring it up, because you don't want to be like, hey, something that happened 2 months ago really bothered me. So like, what is your processing like if something were to aggravate you in the moment before having the hard conversation?
I think, just to say, it's not a one size fit all. Unfortunately, you have to know the person. So if I'm talking to my husband and something aggravates me, he's the type of person that wants to know right in that moment. So I feel comfortable sharing right in that moment. Hey, why did you do that? Can we talk about what your process was on doing that thing? Because it really, frustrated me. Versus I might have someone else who, I know we have a different relationship. So I might not tell them right in that moment that I'm aggravated. I may process it with myself first, think about what actually aggravated me, and figure out if it's even something I need to discuss with them or not. How comfortable we are in our relationships, how well we know each other, and how well we understand the other person we're in relationship with is going to determine how willing we are to have these tough conversations. Because I also think it's important to mention, if you don't feel safe, comfortable, and if you don't have evidence that the person that you're in relationship with is doing their own work in some way, and they're a safe person to have a tough conversation with, you shouldn't be having tough conversations with them. I don't think that it's important to go to people that do not have the tools and capacity to hold space for a tough conversation and share your feelings with them. Brene Brown says, we share our feelings. We're vulnerable with the people who have earned the right to hear our story, meaning they are people that are comfortable and safe to share those things with. We shouldn't be going to people, even if they are our boyfriend or our girlfriend or whatever, and throwing all of our emotions and feelings to them when they haven't shown that they're safe people to hold them, or our parent or our siblings, or any friend group. Like, we have to, and this is why this is the way that I teach anyway. This is why it always starts with coming back to self first. Is this a safe person to have a conversation with? If the answer is yes, okay, check that block. What am I feeling and what do I want to talk about? Okay. And then am I ready to have this conversation in a safe way? Because if I'm not ready to have this conversation in a safe way, meaning I'm going to curse, yell, scream, disrespect somebody, then I need to take a break before I come and have that conversation with them. If I'm ready to have that conversation, ask them, because we have to honor their boundaries. Are you ready to have a conversation about what just happened? Because I'm a little bit frustrated. If they're ready to have it, then great, we can have it. And if they say, actually, can we do it a little bit later? Honor that boundary and wait. And it takes a lot of practice to be able to do that in relationships. And I just want to share that I'm still practicing myself. I think as long as we're living, we're practicing. There's going to be times where everything goes great and you're like, oh my God, that was wonderful. And there's going to be times where you're like, screw this and screw healing. This is not working the way that I hope. Being flexible with yourself and realizing that Sometimes it's going to be easy and sometimes it's not going to be as easy. And both are okay.
You hear a lot when it comes to relationships about picking your battles and not necessarily like going after every little thing. And I think it can be tough, at least in my experience, because if you kind of commit to doing something or somebody says they're going to do something and they don't do it, no matter how big or small it is, like I think, not holding the relationship accountable, I think can lead to negative impacts down the road because you may be with somebody that ends up walking all over you, or you may just end up just losing the ability to hold yourself or your partner accountable, which is never going to be good in a relationship anyway. But I think a lot of times people are afraid to have these tough conversations because they're like, "Oh, is am I exaggerating the problem? Is this too small?" But it's sometimes like the small things over time is what destroys the relationships. It's not necessary. It's not always like the big thing that everybody thinks is going to come. How can somebody, I guess, determine whether or not the issue is worth bringing up to their partner?
Yeah, that's the beautiful part about starting with yourself, because once you learn yourself, you realize, is this a me thing? Am I triggered because of something that has happened in my past that has nothing to do with my partner? Am I upset because of something that I had an expectation around that I never even communicated to my partner? So I'm thinking they should have known something because they know me and they're in a relationship with me when truly I never told them, aka the mind reading thing. I think they should be able to mind read if they love me. That's what starting with yourself allows you to do. Really connect to the fact, am I frustrated because they did something to me? They violated my boundaries, they disrespected me, or am I frustrated because I have some work that I need to do with myself? The other piece that you mentioned, which is really important, is sometimes I did communicate my boundaries. I did say what I needed. I did share the expectation and they're just not meeting it. In those situations, we do have to hold them accountable. We hold them accountable by coming to them and saying, hey, you said you were going to do this. You're going to wash the dishes. You were going to help with getting the groceries. You were going to whatever, and you haven't been doing it. I think it's always helpful to also ask, is there a reason you haven't been doing it? Are you feeling overwhelmed? Like, did you say yes and you had the intention of doing it? Giving people the benefit of the doubt is helpful in being able to have a conversation that doesn't feel like you're being attacked. I know for me, I would love for people to give me the benefit of the doubt. So I don't think giving someone the benefit of the doubt the first time is harmful. Over time, if the person continues to not meet your needs, you continue to have these conversations, they continue to not show up, sometimes we need to have a conversation again. And in my experience, sometimes we don't. I'm just not going to ask you again to do this, particularly in friendships. If I ask you to do something and you say, sure, I'll do it, and 3 times you don't do it, I'm not going to ask you again. And the next time you say, hey, I saw you did this thing, but you didn't ask, I'm going to say, well, I asked you 3 times and you didn't do it. So I just assumed you were too busy and don't worry about it. I don't necessarily take people not showing up as evidence that they don't love me or care about me. I don't know about you, but I'm incredibly busy. Sometimes I want to do things for people and I forget. It doesn't mean that you should say yes and not show up, but I think we're all humaning the best we can and adulting the best we can. However, in a committed partnership, there are different levels of accountability and responsibility. And we do have to have those conversations. And it may be that that person's not able to meet the needs that you have, and we need to shift and change, especially if you're in a committed relationship. Like if you're married or if you're living together, it's important to understand the capacity that your partner has. You may have an idea of what a partner should be doing for you, and they may not be able to meet that. Having that tough conversation is going to help you be able to figure out what works best for both of you.
Right. And I think it all depends on like time and how long you've been in a relationship with that person. Because I think at the beginning, right, the beginning stages of a romantic partnership, it's all about building trust. And so if you commit to doing something together, you ask somebody to do something and they don't do it, well, then it's like, well, if they're not showing up like this now, like when things get settled down in like 3 years, like what's this going to turn into? Right. And so I think those are tough questions to ask yourself, but also I think it could be very beneficial to use like we statements like, hey, we said we were going to commit to this, or we said we were going to do that. So it makes it seem like you're on the same team, because I think in conflict in relationships and in friendships, but we're talking more specifically here about romantic relationships, it's easy for people to get defensive and think it's like, oh, it's you versus me. And it's like, no, like we're a team. Like we're going to work through this together. I'm going to hold you accountable, or I'm going to help us stay committed to the best way possible. And that all I ask from you is that you kind of come alongside me or I come alongside you or whatever the example is in that situation, and we just work together to find a solution instead of like you said, the nip. And that's where the I statements come into play and the we statements, because now it's like it's not like you did this. It's more like let's work together to figure out some sort of resolution. And again, going back to what we were saying a few minutes ago, if that person's not willing to do that, then it's the decision you have to make on whether or not this is a relationship you want to be in. I mean, I heard a quote on my podcast, I think it was I forget, sometime last year, where the person said, "There's plenty of people that I love that I would never marry." Right. And I think that's a hard truth to swallow, is that there's plenty of people that we've all had feelings for, gotten attached to, that might not be the best fit for us in a marriage or in a long term relationship. And it has nothing to do with the other person. It's more just about it from a compatibility perspective.
Yeah, I always talk about this in workshops and with clients that are dating. You don't know this person. I know you like them. I know they seem great. I know that you've been on so many dates and you're, been dating whatever, 6 months or whatever. You do not know them. So in this relationship, you are working to get to know them. Your job right now is getting to know them, getting to understand them, building trust, yes, but also seeing what their expectations are, having those conversations is incredibly important in the beginning, and being honest about what you need is incredibly important. It shouldn't dim the honeymoon phase or make things more difficult or not as fun just because you're being honest with your partner about what you want and what you desire. And I think, especially if you're dating for commitment, or like you want a more serious relationship, is going to save you time. It's going to save you heartache by having those conversations now versus waiting until you get fully into a relationship and ignoring the beginning.
And so I know we spent what, almost 50 minutes talking about the fundamentals and the foundation of what needs to happen for people to successfully build boundaries. As far as like actually setting them more specifically, maybe could you provide a few examples of how somebody can actually set one that doesn't come across as an ultimatum? Because I think sometimes those things can be like interchanged depending on the situation.
Yeah, so a boundary that's an ultimatum is we have to be married by the sixth date or something. Like that's just an example, but we have to be married within our by when we've been dating for 6 months or the relationship is done. That's an ultimatum. That is absolutely not a boundary, because a boundary is permeable, it's flexible, it allows both people to have, you know, autonomy. So we don't want to set those kind of boundaries. But the kind of boundary we might want to set in a relationship is, for me, it's important to be in a partnership where having children is something that's on the table. Are you interested in having children? That is an open-ended boundary. Like, this is what I need. Are you able to meet that boundary or not? The person may say, yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. The boundary is great for both of us. Or the person may say, I know for a fact I don't want to have kids. So then now it's your responsibility to decide, do I want to continue to be in this relationship, even though I know that their boundary is that they don't want to have kids? Because remember, their boundary is no kids. Or do I want to be in this relationship, and maybe just see where it goes, knowing that I might have needs that are unmet. And I think that this is one that comes up big time in relationships, especially for people in their 30s and, for everyone, but especially people who feel like, I'm looking for someone to start a family with now. I'm ready to start a family now. And I think for a lot of people, understanding that although it's not an ultimatum, it is no kidding. This is what you have to be able to meet in order to do this relationship. It's fine to have those kind of boundaries in your life. When you set them, when you set those kinds of boundaries, it's up to you to honor them, not the other person.
How can people avoid setting boundaries out of anger or fear, which I think tends to happen a lot of times?
Yeah, like the ones that like say you need to propose 6 months. I think that's a boundary. The point of that is those kinds of boundaries come from a place of fear. I think we're hard on ourselves and we judge people and we say, we're being hard. You're being. We call people crazy, or we call people all of these names and we judge them. But really, that boundary came out of probably being in a relationship with someone before who they were with for a long time, who never proposed. And so now this time they're like, I'm going to set a boundary that makes sure that it meets my need. Well, the truth is, you can't control when someone's ready to marry you. You can have the conversation about whether you're both interested in getting married and what that time frame looks like. But both people have to be on the same page. So how do you set boundaries without being in fear or being angry? doing your own work. I hate to feel like I keep saying the same thing, but it always comes back to, are you looking at yourself? Are you seeing where your triggers are? Are you seeing where you have had issues in the past that maybe need healing? Working with a therapist, working with the coach, and figuring out what those things are so you're not bringing those problems into your relationship.
What about setting boundaries with family members? I think that's a hot topic right now where people are like trying to do a better job of communicating how they feel to their parents or to their loved ones. What advice do you have for setting boundaries with people in your family?
The thing that I think listeners will hear in this interview is that setting boundaries with anyone is exactly the same, whether it's a family member, whether it's a partner, whether it's a friend. That's why I like to use a lot of different examples. You have to be willing to say the hard thing. I would say that I have seen that parents are the hardest for most people, particularly for daughters with moms. I haven't seen sons with dads as much complain about this, but moms and daughters have had a lot of those things of setting, whether it's mom or mom-in-law, setting those hard boundaries. And I think it's something that will continue to be tough because there's an authority thing happening between both people. But I think knowing that you can set hard boundaries with love, that you don't have to be mean, to be stern, and to be very clear, and repeating the boundary as often as needed, and also setting yourself up for success. So, for example, if when you spend time with your mother-in-law, she's passive aggressive and it makes you feel uncomfortable. But when you have other people around, she's not as passive aggressive. It's more easy to get along. Maybe you want to make sure that when your mother-in-law comes into town, your partner's there, other people are there so that you can have a better time and that your boundary is being met. But also, you're also allowing your mother-in-law to come to your house, like getting creative with ways that you can make sure that you feel comfortable, but also you're not setting ultimatums like your mom cannot come to our house. That may not work for your family. I also think it's important to mention that you can have boundaries with people in relationship, and it doesn't mean you have to cut them off. Sometimes you're in relationships with people and you don't spend as much time with them as you would want to because they're not able to meet your boundaries. So you see them when you can and when you can't because you don't want to be around them because they trigger you or they disrespect you or they don't meet your boundaries. You put space in between you where you need to, and I think that that's something that a lot of us are doing, in particular with family members that we can't see on a regular basis.
How does somebody know when it's time to create more of a permanent boundary with somebody that's not necessarily like abusive or causing harm to them?
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that if someone is causing you, if someone is saying aggressive things, if someone is saying things that are hurtful, it may not be physical abuse, it may not be physical harm, but it is most likely emotional harm. And if you are receiving that from somebody, then you can put that boundary in place. And I think knowing that sometimes you don't have to necessarily pick up the phone and say, I'm putting that boundary in place. You're not meeting my needs. This relationship is over. Sometimes it's just the relationship is done. I know there's a lot of talk on the internet about how ghosting is not healthy. And I agree. I believe ghosting is not healthy. But there are certain instances in relationships where the person is not a safe person to have a conversation with, and the only healthy thing to do is to end the relationship without any further communication. And so sometimes that is the only way forward.
Um, what tips do you have for somebody to improve the way they uphold boundaries, considering that's like the hardest thing of all this, right? Is being able to set a boundary. And then when push comes to shove, even though it's tough and uncomfortable, it's standing up for yourself. How can somebody get better at that?
Oh, this is the hardest part, I think, right? Because the advocating is like, okay, I did the brave thing, I set the boundary, and now I have to say it again. I always like to use the example of people who say, when you come in my house, don't wear your shoes. So you already said, when you come in my house, you don't wear the shoes, and then now you have the person who just walked into your house with the shoes on. Then you have to say, hey, you see that corner over there? That's where you can put the shoes. And although it can feel awkward and weird saying to the person, hey, this is the boundary. Hey, you can't do this. Hey, you can't do that. Remembering that you're just redirecting them and reminding them of what's important to you. They take the shoes off. If they say, I prefer to keep my shoes on, then they've made their choice. And you say, well, I don't let people walk in my house with the shoes. Now, I know that may seem really intense. Like, are you really going to end a relationship or you're not going to let someone in because they don't want to take off their shoes? At the end of the day, people who love you and respect you will honor your boundaries. And the people who don't want to honor your boundaries are in relationship with you probably because you don't have any. So the people who leave probably needed to. And that's the hard but intense truth.
Yasmin, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I think people are going to get a lot of value out of this and hopefully walk away with kind of a guide on how they can better understand themselves and set better boundaries so that they can be happier throughout the course of their life and have better relationships. If people want to follow you, if they want to get a copy of your latest book, if they want to get a copy of of some of the other work that you've done, where's the best place to do that?
Yeah, so follow me Instagram at Yasmine Cheyenne. You can also find my books anywhere books are sold. My recent book, Wisdom of the Path, is available everywhere books are sold. And then my first book, The Sugar Jar, as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. Again, the listeners are going to get a lot of value out of this. And thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.